Okay, welcome back. So this week we are going to continue looking at what sustainability is, and today I want to focus more on what humans are doing in their environment. Now, what I tried to do here is make sort of a sad-looking infographic, and this is modeled off of Hughes, page 41, and it's called the trophic pyramid of energy. And what this really means is, let me bring up my pen here. The sun is producing all the energy that the earth uses. Now, when that comes down, plants end up using the energy to grow. Now, you've got these little animals here. I know they look like hippos. They're actually not. I'm not quite sure what they are, but they're small little animals that eat the plants. And then you've got carnivores that eat the small animals. Now, what I tried to represent here is that you've got quite a bit of plant growth. You've got quite a few small animals, and then not very many of the carnivores or animals on the high point of the food chain. So that's the trophic pyramid of energy. So again, the sun grows plants or helps plants grow, animals eat the plants, and then carnivores, a small number of carnivores, eat the animals. I also want to talk a little bit about the ecology. So you will see in Redmond, page 35 and following, a couple terms here that we need to know because they'll pop up in the literature. So you've got abiotic and biotic. Now, whenever you see, well, not whenever, sometimes when you see an A in front of a word, it's called an alpha primitive, and it means the opposite. So abiotic is the opposite of biotic, and biotic is all the living organisms on the planet. So that's plants, animals, humans. Abiotic is the rest of it. So I've given you a list here: soil, water, air, and climate. That's the abiotic. So that's the entire ecosystem that we will be looking at and seeing how people interact with both the abiotic and the biotic. Okay, we all know that humans dominate our environment, at least in the modern period. And this was really the case in the ancient world, although in different ways. Now, in terms of modern use of the environment, you've got a difference between what humans can do and what the animals can do in terms of animals dominating their environment. So people use information. So we all use the internet and so on, and that really helps us to put collective thought together to change our environment. We have technology. We have these massive, massive bulldozers that can, dig up tons and tons of coal. We've got all sorts of different types of technology that helps us to dominate our environment. We also have economics. So we've got lots of money to put into using our environment, whether good or for bad. And of course, we have social organization. This is another way that we differ from the animals. So our social organization is different, and we can pool together in much larger numbers for a common goal. And in this case, we're talking about doing something to our environment, whether good or bad. Now, when you think about the human ecosystem, so how we are involved in our environment, there are a couple things to think about. Two of them are the driving forces and the mitigating forces. And this is how we deal with our environment. So the driving forces, meaning it's sort of pushing us along. Demographic, meaning population. So we've got large populations of people that can do different things to the environment. And we just mentioned the economy, how that can really drive what we do to the environment, and as well as technology. I also mentioned social, and usually you can't talk about the social without talking about the political. And then of course you have environmental issues that are driving us to do different things. So for example, if you're living in an area where there's a large coal deposits, you may be digging for coal in that particular area. Now, this sounds like we might be talking about the modern period, but this is also the case for the ancient world. Now, mitigating forces, that means something that's sort of slowing us down from what we're doing. So increased disease. So, and here we're talking about human disease, can really affect how we interact with the ecosystem. Now, I'm recording this right in the middle of the COVID pandemic, So we can certainly see how a disease can affect the ecosystem, especially now there's less carbon dioxide being poured into the planet because there's less people out and so on. Higher social tension too can determine how we interact with our ecosystem. So if there's a higher social tension, there's more issues that come up, and we may interact with our environment in different ways because of that. I also wanted to talk a little bit about this graph. Now, I mentioned in the welcome video that we will be looking at lots of scientific papers and how to read different graphs. Now, this is called something called the changing system state graph, and you can find this in our textbook in Redmond, page 39. So what this is really talking about is how ecosystems interact. Now, let me bring my pen up here. So what you have is sort of like a steady state for this line. Now, maybe think about forest growth here. This can apply to lots of different things. You've got forest growth. So you've got trees that are growing, and then there's some type of disturbance. Let's say humans come along and cut down a whole bunch of trees, and this affects the soil. So then you've got this line here, which is the resistance that happens. So how something resists a change to the way it was. Now, in this case, you chop down a whole bunch of trees, and the soil fertility drops. Then over time, what you have possibly is the resilience of the whole system. So you chop down the trees, it drops the fertility of the soil. Over time, the resistance is less, and you get resilience, where the fertility of the soil grows up to what possibly could be the steady state where it was before. And then you get, in this particular case, more disturbances. Maybe the new trees that were growing are cut down. Then you get resilience, and then they're cut down again in the resistance, and so on. And hopefully at some point it gets back to the steady state when people realize what's going on. So this is a graph that will come up in a few of our articles that we'll be reading, but it's important to stop and really think about what these graphs are telling us in terms of the ecosystem. Okay, now I have taken some information from one of our books, and I tried again to make sort of a infographic on what's happening. So as we look at all these different civilizations, so we'll look at the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, the Mayans, the Aztecs, we'll see a fairly typical pattern starting to happen. So, and in this particular case, you've got people learning to grow food. Well, we're going to start looking at the Neolithic next week, which is when people learn how to grow plants and domesticate animals. Now, what happens here is that as people are growing more plants and domesticating more animals, there's more food. So you get a larger population growing. Now, what happens in this case is when you've got a large population, some will still be producing food and some won't. So you've got food producers and those who are not growing food, they're doing something else. They're builders, or they're pottery makers, or so on. Now, what usually happens in this case is that a leader shows up in this group of people. So, and this is what this little graphic is here, someone who decides that they're a leader, and usually that the other people agree that they have a leader. So what tends to happen then is that this leader wants wealth. And in the ancient world, wealth is land, and it's growing food. So he or she, usually a he, will demand more food. And then that's what I've got, this little infographic here, this little graph showing, or this little icon showing a machine. In the ancient world you wouldn't have this, but growing, tearing down trees, making more land available for more food, because the leader wants more food. And food usually leads to more items, so a bigger house, more power, and so on. And then usually what happens is that neighbors want their wealth, the other neighbor's wealth, and you will get war. And then usually in this pattern, and this happens over and over again, the elites, the leaders will lose their power, and then the civilization collapses. Now, what might happen is that the process starts again. So after war, when there's not very many people around, especially the civilization that was there before has collapsed, people will start farming again because they have to eat, and it could start the whole process over. So this again is a cycle or a pattern we will see over and over and over again. And then in our last slide, I have a quote here from Redmond that I really want you to think about. So I'm not going to answer this because it's part of what we'll be really thinking about for the entire class. It's essentially thinking about what shapes us. So has our culture been shaped by the resources that are available, or is it that we shape our society? So that's a really important question to think about. So what you can do is pause the video, read through the question, start thinking about this, because this question will come up over and over and over again in these civilizations.